I know one company that achieved, for example, 37% reduction in injuries. I know another one, 64% in soft tissue injuries. Those are very powerful reduction measures.
Welcome to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast, the podcast that covers all things about humans, technology, and particularly the bits in between.
If I implemented this type of approach, how do I know it's been successful? How am I measuring it? What's because the boards like that, don't they? The senior management board, they want it on a nice dashboard or somewhere. No, that's the big thing. Number of incidents, 0. How am I measuring this? How do I know if it's been successful?
Excellent. That's such an important question, and there's a couple things to it. So let me unpack it. So let's start with the traditional measure of injury rates. And so there are many places and sites where they still struggle with harming people. And learning from normal work can be a very powerful way of reducing that. So I know one company that achieved, for example, 37% reduction in injuries. I know another one, 64% in soft tissue injuries. Those are very powerful reduction measures if there is strong support of the leaders at the site level. And typically, we are able to measure that relatively well at the site level, because the more you expand, the more confounding variables come into play, and the measurement becomes more and more difficult. So number one is, if there are injuries, this is a powerful tool to reduce that. But now, coming back to your point, is what happens when you don't have accidents, injuries, or the number is so low that it's not really meaningful. If you've got 0 and you move to 1 over a year, is that meaningful reduction, deterioration of your performance? That's not very good measure. And so the question is how to go about that. And so let me start with a medical analogy. Think about a stroke or a risk of a stroke, right? That's possibly life-changing, that's high severity incident, and you don't want that. So although hospitals measure how many people were admitted with this heart problem, you don't want to wait to have a stroke to think how to reduce the risk of a stroke. So the medical science runs various research studies, longitudinal studies, trying to find factors that increase the risk and creates a list of those factors, right? So how do you know you've reduced the risk of a stroke without having one? Analogous question, how do you know you've reduced the risk of an accident without having one? Coming back to the medical, you take a list of things that are known to contribute to the increased risk of stroke, and you can address them one by one, right? This may include the physical exercise, the cholesterol level, and so on. Now, please note that the link between the stroke, having a stroke, and contributing conditions is probabilistic and not deterministic. So it means that there are people who don't exercise, have high cholesterol level, and many other contributing factors, and yet they do not suffer from stroke. And the opposite is true as well. You may have very healthy people who happen to have a stroke. But if you take 1,000 people with certain conditions, now at the group level, you will be able to see the tendency. And so now let's apply this to safety. So you have no accidents, but we know from the last 40 years of research, and especially last decade in particular, on complexity and performance variability, etc., we know what creates strong performance. And actually, when I say it, it may become even obvious that if people do not have the right tools, and they do not have the right information, and they work with outdated procedures, and are given 3 hours to complete an 8-hour job, and work 16-hour shift for 4 weeks straight, and so on, that this increase the risk of a problem. It doesn't guarantee a problem. And in fact, because people are so skilled at adapting and overcoming challenges, they manage to adapt to those conditions effectively, meaning no accident most of the time. And so those problems do not guarantee an accident, but your risk is higher. So now, with regard to measurement, using now injuries does not make sense, or it's not that useful. So we need to look into how we manage the work so that people have the right tools when they need them, that they have the right procedure that is usable, accessible, understandable, etc. Right? And so the measure shifts towards how well you are enabling people, how well you're setting up the work environment to execute the work efficiently with what they need. And now that creates also a different shift in focus, because instead of asking, do you know the rules? Or maybe in addition to, because I'm not denying the importance of rules, but in addition to, do you know the rules? The question, there are more effective questions. So if I ask, what do you need to be safe and efficient, right? If I prioritize the human need, whatever they say, and I listen to that and I address that, that would more effectively reduce the risk of failure than me, for example, policing compliance and checking whether they do or do not understand the rules. And there is one more aspect to it, because when we talk about arranging the work or focusing on how the work is arranged, in organizations, it's not uncommon to see conflicting priorities that make the safe arrangement difficult. So, for example, and this is also a true story, there is a procurement team responsible for securing suppliers of spare parts. Okay, and that team that sits in the office somewhere in a big city is rewarded for driving the cost down. So awarding the contracts based on the cost. Now, the implication of that is the quality of the purchased parts is lower. Those parts break more easily. And now the operator in the front line has to deal with that, because either the parts fails and the equipment fails, or creates other problems, leaks, for example, right? And so now they have to adapt and they have to find workarounds. Mm-hmm. And so in this scenario, the goals of the procurement department and the goals of the operations or people in operations are misaligned. Operations need high quality parts that do not leak. But that would mean the procurement team would be penalized for having higher cost of contracts. And so you see how we are now moved with this conversation beyond the direct work environment or the situation of the operator, and more into organization and how the organization sets up the environment for safe execution of work. And there's some fascinating pieces of work looking into those conflicts in priorities and misalignment between corporate functions, and how this misalignment creates the substandard conditions in the front line that people then, what they need to do, that's variability. They have to adapt and find best ways to finish the job with the leaking parts, right? And that leads to risks. And now, having said that, we know that, we can find it, we can address it, and we can reduce the risk.
Big thanks to Barry for inviting me to the podcast. The link to the podcast page is in the video description below. If you'd like to learn more about proactive learning, visit my website, learningfromnormalwork.com. You will find there many resources to get you started, including a free 14-day email course, a comprehensive e-learning training, face-to-face training, as well as multiple examples and case studies. Links in the video description. Thanks.